Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Wednesday night meetings. Well, this is Wednesday when we're recording this, but you guys might be watching this on Tuesday, Monday, Sunday, Saturday, whenever. We're so glad that you're joining us here for The Story. This is where we continue our weekly dialogue about the Bible and all things biblical. If you're just joining us for the first time, we're so glad to have you here. This is a weekly kind of online virtual live Bible study that's brought to you free by the Miami Temple Seventh-day Adventist Church here in Miami, Florida. We are not live on site, at least I'm not, because we're trying to maintain some social distancing. But I am here with my two great friends and colleagues from the church. This is Brian Siwa, our youth pastor. Surprised I probably caught him in the middle of getting some mate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did. There you go. Surprise mate. And then surprise, boom, here comes the feet. Off angled, slightly to the right, and doesn't have the black background. So there he is. Listen, we are so glad that you guys are here today. How you doing, Lafitte?
I'm good, man.
You're good? Fantastic. Listen, we are also glad to have you here with us. One of the things that we really have enjoyed the last couple of weeks is the dialogue that we've been able to have, the questions. We've been getting questions not just live, but also after the series has streamed, and during the week we're getting texts and emails. And so we really appreciate the interaction, and we hope that this continues tonight. The reason why, again, we're having this series is because one of the things that we found is that there's a lot of biblical illiteracy in not just the world, but also our church. Now, you may be saying, oh, it's biblical literacy. We've said this and we will say it over and over. Biblical literacy isn't necessarily today where people say, well, I don't know what the Bible is. Because most people generally may know what the Bible is, or not being aware of what spirituality from a Christian context is. Maybe they've heard of God or angel and all that stuff. However, what we're really realizing that biblical illiteracy looks like now is where most people think that they know what the Bible says, but when they actually read the story, it's actually something completely different. And so today, what we're trying to do is to have a conversation, a dialogue, continuing this talk about what happened in the very beginning of the Bible, starting with the book of Genesis. And this time, we were looking at Genesis chapter 4. So if you have your Bibles, open it up. Boom, Genesis chapter 4. We're looking at this very popular story called Cain and Abel. And you might have maybe read it, maybe you've heard about it. Generally, it's what would you describe it, guys? Like brother kills brother. That's basically it.
Yeah.
The gist. So, but it's all Genesis chapter 4. So the idea here is that the story comes. I mean, let me just give these guys one more thing. I'm gonna kick you guys out, then I'll get back here in a second. So bye. So here, focus up here for a second, because I know I'll give Brian some time to prepare his mate, and then we'll come back. So here's the story with Genesis chapter 4. Overview. Cain and Abel are the first humans born after this post-sin world. And so they basically do their own thing. Cain takes care of sheep, and Abel is actually, no, opposite. Cain is a hunter, gatherer. Abel takes care of sheep. One day they decide to offer their sacrifices to God. Cain gives some fruit. Abel gives some fat from one of his lambs. God accepts Abel's offering and rejects Cain's offering. Cain is upset. God says to him, what's wrong? Like, listen, if you change, don't you think I'll accept it? Cain gets upset, talks to Abel, kills him. We'll get to that. And then God shows up. He's like, hey, where's Abel? And Cain famously says, hey, am I my brother's keeper? Find Abel. And then God, being God, he says, hey, listen, I know where your brother is. His blood's crying out to me from the ground. What have you done? So because you disobeyed, obviously you killed your brother, I'm going to exile you, etc., etc. And Cain says, no, this punishment is too great for me. Anyone who finds me will kill me. Hold on to that about who would kill him in this situation. And so God says, relax, I get it. No one's going to kill you. I'm going to put a mark on you. And so this mark is going to be what distinguishes you, because if anyone tries to kill you, you will be avenged sevenfold. And so he exiles him. And so Cain goes to live in this place called Nod. It's east of Eden in this story. And so then he takes a wife. I know there's probably going to be a question about that when we get to the Q&A. And then he has a son named Enoch, makes a city after his son Enoch. And then it has some descendants of him. It lists several descendants, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 generations deep. And then near the end of Genesis chapter 4, there is this interesting little story of one of the descendants of Cain named Lamech, where Lamech takes 2 wives. I think one's name is Ada and no Zipla or something to that effect. And he says, "Hey, listen, wives of Lamech, come over here, listen up, listen to my speech." This is basically what he says. Listen, I'm a bad man. I killed a guy for just looking at me bad, and I killed a young man for basically dusting up my sneakers. It's basically the equivalent in the Hebrew. So if anybody tries to kill me, if Cain was avenged 7 times, I'm gonna be avenged 70 times 7 times. If anyone, if you know a little bit of the whole biblical chronology, remember this. We'll get back to this in a second. And so that's where it finishes. Genesis chapter 4 is the story of Cain and Abel, and it's crazy. No, actually, excuse me. Near the end of Genesis chapter 4, after this Lamech, there's a story of Adam meeting his wife Eve again. They have another child named Seth, and then something happens to Seth, and at the chapter ends, we're saying that after the son of Seth was born, there is this this line that says, from this point on, people started calling on the name of God. So remember, we're starting building blocks. And I know that when we look at this text, it's important to remember a few things as we get into the dialogue here. When I bring Lafitte and Brian back into the story, is that it's very easy for us to try to get hung up on a lot of the details and try to say, well, what happened to this? What happened to this? What happened to that? Or try to bring other things that we may have thought we heard about the story before, kind of imposing it on it. But remember, the Bible is not written as a history book. It wasn't there doesn't give eyewitness accounts. This is something that was written later on by Moses. We talked about this in the first episode. It doesn't mean that everything was fake and none of it can be trusted. It doesn't mean that it's all one big old allegory to teach some sort of lesson like clean your room. You know what I'm saying? It's not that. But when it comes to having this dialogue, more than anything else, is to teach us as human beings to try to wrestle with these experiences of people who have lived before us and how they interacting with God. And so something that today that we're going to try to explore kind of deep is, what relation do our choices and do our family of origins impact, or how do they impact our growth and development? There's a lot to be said about family systems. If you are study of the social sciences, you might know a little bit about stages of development and family systems theory. So a lot of it's going to come out here when you look at how Adam and Eve and then their children, that dynamic came up. So let me bring Brian and Lafitte back into the stream here. So guys, give me your thoughts on Genesis chapter 4. What do you guys think? And Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, all that stuff.
Well, first of all, we know that Cain and Abel were not the first children. They may have been the first male children. You know, Genesis 5 tells us that Adam had sons and daughters. So that's where we're going to get to that later on. The other thing, it was interesting that Eve named Cain, and the word Cain means acquire, the one. And then Abel, she named Abel nothing. That's what it means. Abel
means nothing?
It means nothing. It means
Cain means what now again?
It means acquired. Acquired. Remember, Genesis 3:15 said that there was going to come a seed. And so she probably thought that this is the seed that was promised. And so those are my two thoughts as I throw it in. Go ahead, Brian. Take it from there.
Well, I think, yeah, it means nothing. And you also mentioned when we talked briefly that it could also mean vapor, right?
Vapor. Yep.
It could also mean vapor. So it's a little something, right?
Vapor, like un pedo, like just like
Abel was nobody. It was like
nobody.
Right. No, I mean, that's a good point, because it's like, all right, I did what I needed to do. I gave birth to this one son, and that's the son that I needed according to like the promise, how I interpret God's promise, right? And so she did that. But what I saw in the passage, which really takes me back to chapter 1, is, or chapter 3, the fall, is this idea that, you know, God shows up to Cain and he tells him, hey, listen, man, sin is crouching at your door, basically warning him like, hey, you're prone to do this. And the reason why that sticks out to me is because when I go back to the fall, and Eve sins, it kind of lets me know that at some point, I want to assume that at some point God spoke to you, was like, hey, listen, this might happen. You might be having these thoughts. Listen, just try to stay away, you know. And same thing with Adam. And I don't know, that's something that I was just thinking about, just from the story itself.
And Brian, it's interesting because once again we see God coming to Cain and he's asking him, "Where's your brother?" And what Cain should have said was, "I killed him." What? But the answer he gave was, "I don't know."
So we're gonna divide this talk into 3 different sections here, and I told the guys before this, you're gonna see a lot of repetition in terms of what's already happened in the story, how God interacts with Cain and Abel compared to how God interacted with their parents. So the first stage of like this dialogue, let's talk about it from the beginning of Genesis chapter 4, where it says Adam knew Eve, and then we're gonna finish it to where Brian talked about where God shows up to Cain and he's like, "Hey, Cain, listen, you could do better." And then we're gonna get the next section here to where Cain finally kills Abel. So check this out, guys. If you have your Bible, it like Lafitte said, when God made that promise to Eve in Genesis 3, he says, I'll put enmity between your seed and her seed, and this lineage is the descendant of Eve. He, and that's a male term, would stomp the head of the snake. And so Eve, like Lafitte said, the idea was that Cain must be that child. So she thought, that's it. So a few months later, she has a second one. Oh, a second boy. We're set. All right, what's his name? Let's call him
Nothing.
Yeah, let's call him Nothing. Hey, Nothing. You know what I'm saying? So they have this child, and he grows up, and even more. Think about what it says in verse 3. In verse 2, where it says where Cain was a tiller of the ground. So Cain knew how to work the ground. In some ways, maybe Adam thought about what God had told him, where it says, "Hey, listen, the ground would not yield you any fruit, and now my son, who might be the heir apparent, he's taking on this role." But definitely, these seem to be the first children born after sin happens. Remember, Adam and Eve have lots of children, but there's not a whole lot of mention beyond the Cain and Abel and the line of descendants that is then said in Genesis chapter 5. So there's presumably more kids that they have. And then, there's that whole issue. But let me ask you guys, from your thought, what's the big deal with the offerings, with God rejecting Cain's offering of fruits, but then accepting Abel's offering? What was the issue there? You think it was some sort of like arbitrary issue? Like, what was the deal with it?
Well, it tells us in verse, it tells us that Abel brought the best to God. And so here you see Abel is bringing the best to God, where we could assume that Cain did not bring the best.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Anything else, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, exactly like Lafitte said, it wasn't like, oh, you brought something I don't like. I don't like the taste of carrots. I prefer to have some roasted lamb. Like that wasn't the dilemma. The dilemma was what they brought, what they brought, not what they brought, their tokenism, and their tokenism in the sense of like, hey, I brought the best of what I had. Now, if I believe like if Cain would have brought the best of like his gardening skills could produce, then I think I would have looked at that with a good eyes as well. But it's just to show like it's about what you bring, and what you bring really kind of gives God the idea of like what you think of him, right? And so just to put it, I guess, in church terms, because we're all three of us are pastors here. Am I bringing something of sacrifice that of all my work, this is my prized work. Like this is what I produce. This is what I'm proud of. I'm gonna give God that. I believe that that's kind of like what the sensation that you get when you read this, that Abel brings to God, is something that he cherished, and Cain was just like, I'll just give him some of this, You get what I'm saying?
And it's interesting that God is asking Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? It wasn't that God was upset with Cain. It was Cain got angry because he probably saw that God was accepting Abel's offering.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Something that I think to piggyback what Brian was saying, then connect it with you. I think when I read what happened with Cain and Abel, it's interesting that it says that God in verse 4 that the Lord respected Abel's and his offering, but he did not respect in verse 5 Cain and his offering. You know, what sacrifice does it take for you to give God some fruit from your tree? Like, what kind of personal sacrifice does it take? You know, yeah, it's an inconvenient. Maybe they didn't have the tools we had. He probably have to go up and crawl and grab the best. We don't know if it was even the best. It might have just been some fruit. He could have fallen from the ground. Who knows? But the point is, he gave God some fruit. But how much sacrifice does it take to give some fat from a firstborn? In other words, Abel's sacrifice literally required him to kill something, whereas Cain's offering didn't require any sort of the bloodiness, if you think, right? Not that God loved, like, oh, I like to see the blood. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's not the idea. But the idea is that, you know, thinking about what happened in Genesis 3, where God makes these tunics for Adam and Eve and reminding them of, remember, Genesis 4 built on Genesis 3. So there's this idea that God wants them to understand the gravity of sin and what their sin has done. And so Cain just tries to give him some fruit, but Abel says, you know what? No, this is something that we need to be reminded. I need to be reminded that this requires sacrifice. So taking away a calf means that there's one less calf that he has in the fold to kind of work on. And so it requires more of a sacrifice. But you know, like the feet said, here's the craziest thing. It's not as if God saw Cain's thing and was like, you know what? Nah, forget this. You're messed up. Why did you bring me this? Cain is upset. But God's like, hold up, listen, relax. Like, we're good. We're good.
Yeah.
But and it's interesting. It's almost like relational dynamic where God stands his ground, says something that you're doing, I don't like it. I don't appreciate. But like we talked about on Tuesday, it's Cain who expects God to change. He doesn't want to change. He's like, you should accept what I'm giving you. And I feel like Cain a lot of times in some ways, where it's like, well, God, like, I'm giving you this. Why? What's up with this? You know, how many times do we expect God to change rather than we change the way that we view things, the way we approach things? I don't know. That's just me speaking personally.
Yeah. And, you know, and one of the things that I'm appreciating from our studies, the three of us, we have to turn off everything that we learned in school, all the extra reading, spirit of prophecy, all of that. And we're just reading the text. And so we could bring in everything that we heard and everything that we know, that, you know, the Lamb foreshadowed Jesus, and that we're looking at the text, because what we're doing is, if you're sitting with someone who is like Nelson, you said, is biblically illiterate, we want to walk with them in the passage. So that's what we're doing here, you know? So the temptation is to just give those answers that we know, because we heard the story of Cain and Abel since we were little kids.
So we are going to get to some questions. We're not gonna figure this out completely, because you're gonna see there's some questions that show up in this text, and you're like, hold up, what happened here?
We're gonna say things that I know that if you go to Patriots and Prophet, the answer is there. But remember, we're going with just the Bible. Okay, it's okay. It's not that we don't believe. It's just that we're taking this journey with you.
Okay.
Right. Verse 7 kind of spells it out for us a little bit. God is speaking to Cain. He says, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? And that leads you to believe that Cain knew what was right. Cain knew what should be offered and the work that it should take for him to offer that, what God would be pleased in. And that's why God asked him, hey, if you were to give what is right, would you not be accepted? In other words, you know what is right, so just give what is right. And Cain was, or at least seems to be, a person that's very just full
proud.
Of them. Yeah, it's like, no, I'll give you what I want to give you, and just very rebellious in that way. And God's not having it.
Right. Something to connect with you guys, as something to, I guess, to connect the dots in the future. I know someone said here, Lorna, about think God would have been playing about the offering should be. It would make sense. We don't actually see God saying you need to do this, 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 and this. So a lot of what we're saying kind of imposes on this. But one of the things that you got to understand is that when God finally established this Levitical system in the book of Leviticus, looking forward, there are times where God does accept like grain offerings. He doesn't just accept like blood offerings. So there were sometimes you could give God certain things. But what we're seeing here is that there's, like when you said, Brian, where there's a heart issue where Cain isn't, for some reason, isn't giving God what he asks. And God tells him, listen, like Brian said, it's not that I don't like you. It's that what you're giving me probably is not in the right spirit. And the one thing I really love about this, the thing that I guess parallels back to what God told Adam and Eve, is that, listen, in verse, where is this here? In verse 7, he says, right after he says, if you do well, will you not be accepted? But he says, if you do not do well, sin lies at the door. Its desire is for you, but you should rule over it.
Yes.
So he's giving him a warning. He's saying, listen, if you hold on to this resentment, this anger you have towards me, I'm not angry at you. But if you hold on to this, sin is waiting at the door to come for you. It wants to rule over you. It wants to beat you. It wants to take its desire. But your call, you should rule over it. You ought to be able to rule over it. And so even in a post-sin world, he's giving humans almost like credit. He's saying, listen, yeah, sin is at your door, but a lot of times you know what the right thing is to do. And sin's desire is to beat us, but you can rule over it. Don't take this and be like, oh, we can be perfect and sinless because somebody's out there going to be like, yeah, I can beat this myself. No, that's not the point. But in this situation, what he's saying is that, listen, there's more than just your understanding of good and bad. There is a real force out there that's trying to work its way into your life. So remember, you're trying to, it's almost like he's a parent trying to educate a son into like do things the right way. But recognize that, hey, there's danger out the door, and recognize that unless you work on this, it's gonna roll over you. It's gonna beat you.
Yeah, and a lot of times, I mean, Nelson, I think like this is what's, not, I mean, wrong, but what's bad about, or what's wrong about religion today, right? What's wrong about religion today is that many times we want to just give the church or God, we want to give whatever it is that we want, right? And so it's like, oh, you want money? Here's all the money in the world. But that's not even what God asks. God's not asking for your money. God, at least in the New Testament, right? He's asking for our heart, right? For our mind. And when you look at it that way, and you see exactly what you said, that Cain is coming from a place of he wants to just like self-impose, like like
he's telling God, take it or leave it.
Self-sufficient. I don't need you to tell me how to worship or how to do this or how to do that. And you really see that that's his position throughout this chapter, which is really sad.
I think Marlon posted something here, and I think you're right on the head. He's like, for me, it was about obedience, not about the object itself, just like Adam and Eve. Bingo. Because once again, this is the parallel that goes back to Genesis chapter 3, where they both have a choice to make. And it was, thank you. You're not wrong. I mean, really, like this is where we talk about this, where the choice to make was theirs. And it's interesting that rather than God coming down and saying judgment right away, just like happened with Adam and Eve, God goes back and he's like, listen, you can improve this next time. You can do better. God's coaching them. So right. It's no longer a matter of even being perfect, because we're not in a perfect world. But God is saying, you can improve on this. You definitely can. You just need to get better. Now, we're going now to the second side of this. So Cain's upset and he's chilling. He's upset. Now, if you go here to verse 8, it says, now Cain talked to his brother Abel, and some versions, they actually have a little postscript, a little a, where it mentions at the bottom. There's several different versions, not versions of the Bible, but manuscripts of the Bible. Some of them, many of them,
does not have.
Don't include this certain section called where it says, And Cain talked to his brother Abel, and some of them include this saying, says, "Let us go out to the field."
Yeah.
Now, the reason why this is important to mention will be evident in a little bit, because then it says here in this section. Now, if you read it without it, it says, "Now Cain talked with his brother Abel, and it came to pass that they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him." Now, what's the difference, you think, if you include this, "Hey, let's go out to the field," and then also this, "Cain rose up and killed them"? What's the implication of that versus it not being there?
Well, in the Torah, the commentary says that it wasn't premeditated a murder. So if he said, "Let's go to the field," there's an implication that he had in his mind that he was going to kill his brother. And so without it, it's, you're having a conversation. Yeah, premeditated murder.
Yeah, you guys get it.
Yeah. And so they were just talking, and probably in the heat of an argument, se le zafó la mano.
Do you remember, dude, do you remember in Miami just last week, if you guys remember WSBN, or there was this guy in North Miami that he was upset with his mom and he shot and killed her. Do you remember hearing about that? Right now, this was in Miami, like this is last week, where this guy got upset and it was over something stupid. She wanted him to stop borrowing the car, and he's like, "I need it for work," and they got upset about something, and he ended up shooting her, and he calls the cops. And he's like, listen, he's sobbing. He's like, "You need to come over. I just killed my mom." And everyone's heartbroken. He's heartbroken. He understands he killed his mom. He's in jail. But the difference is that he recognizes this was in the heat of the moment. I had a bad day. And he killed her, versus, like you said, be like, "All right, I'm going to fix this guy. Hey, let's go out to the field."
Yeah. And so for my notes here, it says that the death penalty is imposed only when it was premeditated. So an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. So that's where commentators are saying, well, that's why God did not strike him down.
And that's interesting because, here it's interesting that the same question that sort of God gives to Adam and Eve, he gives to Abel. He's like, he doesn't say, "Where are you?" He's like, "Where's your brother?" So God's kind of wanting him to tell, "Hey, what's going on? Like, tell me what's going on." And remember what I said last week is the main question that the Bible's trying to answer is, can God be trusted?
Because Steve is saying, I'll put it up here. Steve is saying he lured him with the intention of murdering him. It wasn't spur of the moment. If that was the case, then God would have struck him down. According to the law that is in the Torah.
Yeah. I mean, just like Nelson explained, you have that footnote. Most Bibles will have that footnote that says that was probably that section of him luring him out to the field was added in later manuscripts.
Later on, right.
Either way, I think that, in this case, Cain didn't have like a club in his hand and was like, "Hey, brother, let's go out to the field. Don't worry about this club with nails on it. Like, I'm not going to use it." Let's go out to the field.
Okay, Negan. Yeah.
Which kind of like changes the tone a little bit. Where if I was a cop receiving a call from this guy, it's like, "Well, why did you have a gun with you? Like, what is your, what's your plan there?" So it's not. I don't believe Cain had like a weapon on him to kill his brother with when they were in the field together. I think if you go and you read the text for what it says, it doesn't talk much about luring, or it doesn't really give that away. It just talks about them being in that field together at the same time. And something happened, and Cain snapped. And it was something that was foreseen. It was foreseen by God. That's why God has that personal one-on-one conversation with him. Which is really powerful if you think about it, because most of the time when you think about what happens in the fall is God, cast them out of the garden. He cast Adam and Eve out of the garden to make a life outside of the garden. But here with the story of Cain and Abel, we see that God doesn't stay in the garden just chilling, like, "All right, you guys do whatever you can over there. try to live your lives as good as you can. I'm just going to sit here and wait to see how this plays out. He leaves the garden with them. That's why Cain gets to have that conversation with God, because God is still present even though we're at our worst, and they were at their worst. And so I think that that's a valuable lesson that we need to kind of contemplate on when we're reading Genesis, is the fact that over and over again, God demonstrates who he is. He is a loving God that's always present and always wants the best for us.
Amen. By the way, because I see Maria was talking about how long before this story in the book of Leviticus, but the death penalty is not coming in the book of Leviticus. You actually see it in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, where God says, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind.
In 9?
Chapter 9, Genesis chapter 9, verse 6.
Yeah, that is after. Okay, we're gonna get there in a few weeks.
Yeah, but my point is, this is not in the Leviticus. This is right here in the book of Genesis.
Right. Well, I think she's saying because you mentioned that it was Leviticus.
Yeah.
But I think when you look at that, I think what she's trying to say is that when you look at legal, the question here is what sets a legal precedent. In this case, the legal precedent, there was no precedent. According to scripture, this is the first murder. So it's like God is having to figure out what to do with this situation kind of as it's happening. But and that's what I was going to say. There's a difference when God asks Cain, where's your brother? If it was premeditated, if he knew what he did, then think about it. He could have been like, am I my brother's keeper? Versus if it wasn't premeditated, heat of the moment, my God, I had to fight my brother. I killed him. I don't know what to do. And God asked him, hey, where's your brother? He's like, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? I don't know where he's, because he's nervous. Yeah. There's a difference between being nervous versus being arrogant. Now, which way is it? I think that we tend to believe that this was a murder, but not a premeditated murder because of, like, check this out. So then when God says in verse 10, and you run to the kind of third section, your brother's blood cries out, and receive to me the blood from your brother's hands. And so basically I'm sending you out to live in this land. But then Cain kind of appeals back to God. He says in verse 13, he says, listen, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Surely you have driven me out from this day from your face to the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive. And so it's interesting, like he's calling out to God, and he's like, listen, I don't want to be outside of your sphere. I want to be a part of this, where if anyone finds me because of what I've done, they're going to kill me. Now, God could have, again, simply God could have just killed him right there. But once again, we are trying to answer the question of, can God be trusted? Who saw Cain murder Abel? There's only one person, God. There's only one witness in this case, God. So had God killed Abel with no witnesses to see the murder, then the implication here is, again, can God be trusted? Well, God is judge and jury, and nobody actually saw this, but we got to take God's word for it, which, again, you go back to Genesis 3, we already were there. No one took God's word for it. So had they killed him in Genesis 4, then again, the question would be like, okay, God killed Adam and God killed Cain. Well, who saw the murder? I wasn't there. So why'd he kill him? Yeah. So again, just thinking about this, it's kind of like God is in a hard place because he's trying to do justice, do right by Abel. He recognizes that blood is crying from the ground, but he also recognizes that he's setting a precedent. And if he simply just executes that judgment right there, then would people be more willing to worship and love him for who he is versus be driven into this fear-based mentality like, oh, shoot, God's not playing around real quick. You know what I'm saying? So instead, God gives Cain a mark. And there's no indication what that mark is. What some people you've heard it says it's a tattoo.
No, so before you go any further, here in my Jewish commentator, it says the Hebrew word translated here as my punishment, avani, may also be translated as my sin, suggesting that Cain was unable to bear the guilt he felt for killing his brother.
Oh, it's
Interesting.
good that you mentioned that, because literally what I was about to say was, notice how it just says punishment. It doesn't say guilt. Like to me, just, I mean, NIV English rendition, right? It seems like the guy's not even guilty about what he did. So I'm glad that you read that commentary, because just looking at it point blank, I'm like, wow, he's not even guilty. He doesn't even feel guilty about what he's done.
So you're saying that his punishment, in other words, it wasn't necessarily just a punishment, but it was also his sin of killing his brother was more than he could bear.
Yep.
Okay,
that's what the Torah says.
That's an interesting point of view. One of the things that was very cool about the Jewish way of life was that they would sit on Sabbath afternoons and they would kind of talk about these things, about sections of the Bible where they're reading. We don't do a whole lot of that today, but because I don't know, we're just so busy. But it's interesting to kind of think about the story in that way. Now, yeah, so to answer your question, I think I see here, Sylvia, was it a crime of passion? I tend to believe it could have been, because we have evidence of other instances. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago with Miami, where there was a situation this last weekend. This son killed his mother. It wasn't premeditated. He just killed her because they got upset. He was in the field. There's a saying called "hurt people hurt people," and if you think about this, think about what Jesus said in the future when he was like, "Yeah, you may not be a murderer, but if you even basically treat your brother with contempt, you hate your brother in your heart, that's the same as murder." And so, how many times the whole kick the dog syndrome happens, where we're upset with something else and then we take it on somebody else? And it might be a minimal thing, but Jesus is like, no, if you get upset with someone else because of something you have going on, that's the same as Cain killing his brother. But in this case, Cain kills his brother because he's probably upset because God's not accepting him. He doesn't want to change his life. And then all of a sudden he kills him and he's like, oh, geez, what do I do here? God shows up and God, there's more than I can bear. And that's an interesting point about this sin being the murder of his brother. But God allows Cain to live. So he puts a mark in his face. Some different not on his face. It just says a mark. I'm saying face because there's a movie that I saw where he does this, and then there's like a mark on his forehead. That's where I remember that from. Some different commentators, and I'll just throw this out there. There's different belief systems that some have said that the mark was Cain being black.
Yep.
I do not believe that. That is probably there's nowhere. No, yeah, absolutely. That's something I came across, and I was okay, this all right. And so there's no evidence of that in the text. Some people have said it's like a tattoo, but it's interesting. Again, a lot of times people impose their own stereotypes and prejudices on the text versus what the text actually says. The text doesn't say any of that stuff.
And if he was, then they probably all were.
What?
And if he was black, then they probably all were black,
Well, he's saying that God made him black there.
Yeah.
Oh, never mind.
Yeah.
Wow.
I did corrected that one. Yeah. No, yeah. That's why I was like, hold up, what? Yeah. That was the mark that some people say that it was.
But that was interesting that it's a mark and it's a blemish, but it was actually a lifesaver for Cain. Yeah.
And he's like, people would recognize scarlet letter on his forehead, just like Maria Maury said. That people would find him then. Now, here, if you're thinking about this, you're like, hold up, time out. People would find you and kill me? Who's there to kill me? Then later on it says that, say what?
His siblings. Adam had sons.
Later on it says as well that Adam, or here we go here to verse 16 and 17, that Cain knew his wife and they have a son. And so people have asked, like, I remember people were upset and were like, well, hold up, you're telling me that Cain met his sister? I'm like, at this point, if you want to be honest, there's nobody else here. And I want to be very clear about this. And I'll, you guys can give your thoughts on this in a second. But whether or not you are talking about evolutionary theory or whether you're talking about creation theory, at some point, all of these trees are going to go back. Unless someone met a monkey or an alien. At some point, if we're all part of the same race, same DNA, Okay, and I'm not using race as a color race. I'm using it as a species. If we're all part of the same species, at some point you got to go back to a cluster of family, right? Whether or not you're looking at creation or evolutionary perspective. And so the idea here is that the text is saying, hey, listen, Adam and Eve were created perfect in the image of God. So what kind of, and we know nowadays that, listen, if you marry your sister and you have kids, they're going to come out deformed, obviously, because one, ew, it's gross. Two, there's a lot of like what's it called? Like basically like the genetics part where it's just going to mess with the genes. So it's you don't do it. But the point is, back in those days, if God made perfect beings with perfect DNA, then perfection plus perfection would create another, presumably, near perfect child. It wasn't until later on we get in the book of Leviticus. Is it like Leviticus seems to be the one that says, "Hey, listen, let's go. We're gonna stop that." There's another section here about fallen angels coming down. That's Genesis chapter 6. We'll get to that.
We'll get to that.
But again, huh?
No. What I was just in verse 3. Go ahead, Nelson. I'm sorry.
I'll just finish. The point is that there probably were other humans back then. Yeah. Cain and Abel were the first documented children post sin. But if the story happens where Cain says, "Hey, who's gonna find me? Who's gonna kill me?" If the story is just Cain, Abel, Adam, and Eve, if they're just the four, then who are all those people? Then you're gonna have to figure out who these people are.
Yeah. So what I was going to say is that in verse 3, it says, in the process of time. We don't know how many years have passed. Hundreds of years. We don't know. And so there probably was many other people that were living at this time.
So here we find, let's go to the last section. So here then Adam, this guy's exiled, and we don't have him mention like what happened between Adam and Eve. Did they meet Cain? Did he just leave immediately, just take his wife? But imagine the hurt that Adam and Eve must have felt, thinking that this guy was chosen one, only for him to end up not giving life to everyone, but having taken away his brother's life. So imagine the hurt and the pain that they must have felt. And so then they have the story of Cain meeting having these children, and it ends with this really weird like declaration of Lamech having 2 wives. What's up with that? What do you guys think about that? From verse 16 to about verse 24.
So I mean, just right off of verse 16, where Cain kind of leaves God, right? He's like, okay, that's my judgment. All right, I'm leaving. God's curse on him was that he was going to be a wanderer, right? And that the ground wouldn't yield the fruit that it did to Adam and to his other siblings. But then, like, the first thing that you see him do, after he bears children, is he builds a fortified city, right? A fortification. And that leads you to believe 2 things. One, he is saying, well, he's trying to protect himself from being a wanderer. So he's like, I don't want to be a wanderer anymore. I'm going to stay put. And 2, the idea that, like, okay, I don't want anyone to, enact vengeance on me for what I did. And so I will build a fortified place. And so even after, grace technically is shown on him and he's not killed there on the spot, he is still living the same kind of life that he was when he killed his brother. There has been no change in him, apparently, from what I read right now in the text. And so that's a huge difference when it comes to anyone, is the fact of when you encounter God's grace, are you willing to change or are you not?
There's also an interesting point here where it says in verse 20 and 21, one of Cain's descendants dwelled in tent and livestock. And then verse 21 says another one of his descendants was the one who played the harp and the flute. So there were a lot of technological advances that happened with Cain's family. Even when you talk about verse 22, where Tubal Cain is an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. So there's even a historical, you can say, kind of connection. Back then, we're talking about the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. So apparently, according to Moses, some of Cain's descendants were directly responsible for helping to create this advancement in the technological understanding of what was going on at the time. So they moved from, I can't remember if it's Stone Age. Well, Stone Age is the first, but I don't know if it was bronze or iron first, in that historical designator. So Cain's children did do certain things that helped move everyone along, but it seems like they kind of kept this to themselves, because here at the end we say Lamech takes his wife. Oh, and by the way, one thing I was going to say, if you look at some of these names, keep these names of Cain's children in mind, because they are going to show up again next time. A lot of the same kids, they're not the same people, but it seems like
the names
kind of repeated. Not exactly even the same order, but it's just interesting about the way that those things kind of happen, where it seems like this is giving the story of Cain's family. And one of the things that we were talking about, we had a good discussion about this on Tuesday, is that your past does not define you. The context that you grow up with does not determine how you're going to end up, but it's somewhat helpful to understand where you are by looking at where you came from. And this is where I think, looking at the story of Cain and his family, you see, you don't even know how it ends, because, like, I'll let Brian kind of say this a little bit in his thoughts, where it just kind of, what we talked about last time, where you said kind of just whatever. I'm setting you up. I'm giving you a little Dwayne Wade ball so you can dunk it like LeBron. But the point is that it kind of stops at this point where, and that's where the end of Cain's story, it's where Cain's legacy stops. Whereas you see Seth's descendants through Adam now kind of continue the story, not because they're better, not because they're just like intrinsically, better, but because it says here in verse 26, there's something happens between Seth and the birth of his son Enosh, that then the relationship of this branch of the line of Adam and Eve, they not only are giving sacrifices, but now they're actually calling on the name of God. And so I think there's a huge difference between people just offering sacrifices, because if we look at, let's look at the parallel today. People can offer sacrifices left and right, and people do think they're giving God the best of their time. And that's great. Sacrifice is one part of what we can do for God. But there's something, the whole story is fundamentally about a relationship. When Adam didn't trust God, that's a relational failure. When Cain didn't trust God enough to tell him where his brother was, that's a relational failure. But when it says that men started calling on God, there's a recognition of failure and recognition of trying to reach out for something better. That shows that there's something about this relationship among this family, that they're trying to seek God instead of just appeasing God. They're trying to find out who God is by calling out to him. And so that's part of the interesting thing that I saw here in the last section here of Genesis 4. What do you guys see here in the last few sections?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm gonna have to take your pass and try to make a 3-point shot or something. And yeah, I'm totally with you on that, because you see his family, Cain's family, right now, and you see that he has Enoch, and Enoch has Lamech, and Lamech even builds a greater city and greater things. And when you stop and you look at that, you're like, wow, it's progressively getting more like further away from this God figure that provides everything. It's like, no, I'm going to provide everything for myself. And to the point where now you see like this progression of, at least of being further away from God on Cain's family, but then on Abel's family, not Abel, sorry, Seth's family, you see a progressive like theological understanding of who God is, and you see it first with Eve when she births her first child that is mentioned here, right? Cain. She's like, oh, this is the one, right? I gave birth to this, and then the second child was like, oh, it's whatever, it's just
vapor,
right? Vapor.
Nothing.
And then the third, Seth, in a way, it's like, oh, he was given to me. And so she goes from an understanding of like, I did this, to this doesn't really matter, to no, God gave me this. And then you see that also in Seth's descendants, where Seth, when he names his child, it's like, yeah, it's because it's all because of God, basically. And so every time that they're naming their children and what they're doing, they're acknowledging the fact that they're completely reliant on this God, on a God that is the same God in Genesis chapter 2, right? This creation God. And not to like bother anyone, if we have anyone listening that has like Jewish background, I'll say it in English, like that the Jehovah God that is talking about here, that they name, you know, the Lord Jehovah.
Oh yeah, the Tetragrammaton. Yeah.
Right, it's the same Jehovah that is talking about in Genesis chapter 2. And so it leads you to believe that Seth and his family have this understanding that this God, this creator God, is the same one in Genesis 2 that it is now, and it's the same one that's going to provide for them. That they can't do it on their own. They can't live life on their own. They need this creator God to be able to continue to create in them someone that actually represents the image of God.
Let me give you one thing though. One slight difference here is that this is important because that name of the Lord in Genesis 24:26 isn't actually the Tetragrammaton, isn't Yahweh that we find, where it says they called on the name of the Lord. This is the second time that the word actually is Adonai.
Adonai. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So and
I
this
thought
is
personal. It was a personal name.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. You're right. You're right. Yahweh versus Elohim.
Yes.
Yeah, my bad. My bad. That's on me. You're right. That Tetragrammaton Yahweh, the way we understand, that's more of the personal God instead of Elohim that we find in Genesis when it's saying God created. So that's the second time, where we find that these people are calling God that personal covenant name.
Yeah.
Rather than just, oh, God is there. Now he's like my Lord.
Yep.
With all of its implications. Yeah, Adonai comes in the future. That was on me.
Yeah. What I was going to say is that this phrase "invoke the Lord by name," you'll see this in the Old Testament over and over as public worship. So now you're seeing it. The worship goes from a personal experience to a public display of this is my relationship with God. Is not something that I'm doing on an altar privately. I'm letting the whole world know I have a real walk with God. And so that's the power of that. And that's the shift that we're seeing as the book ends.
Good. Hey, by the way, guys, if you will have questions, now is a good time to just start leaving them in the chat box. We'll get to as many as we can this week. Those that we can't, we'll try to get next week. But start saying them off.
Did you see Marlon's comment?
Yeah, that's why I laughed. that's why I laughed.
Not that one. This one.
This one here at the bottom here. Dwayne dropped the ball. I was setting it up and I dropped it. That's why I laughed.
Can you?
This one.
You're here making a good point, and I'm here messing it up. Like, yeah, no, it's actually Adonai. No, it's okay.
No, can you mention like Adante's point there, because that's kind of like what you were saying, Nelson, that a lot of these names repeat themselves, but they're not in the same family. That Enoch is not Cain's son Enoch. That is on Seth's side's Enoch.
Right.
So you have a lot of the same names on both sides of the family, but that's a different Enoch.
Yeah, so you're gonna see if you go here to verse. Let's look. You're gonna see this next time when you start reading Genesis chapter 5. But we have some names that repeat themselves. One is Enoch. Enoch is a name that repeats again later on. It's not the same Enoch that walked with God and then God took him. This was an Enoch who has a city built after him, and it's interesting. These are people who are trying to make names for themselves, versus people that are walking with God and giving God what kind of recognize the glory and praise comes from him. So you see Enoch in verse 17, but then you also see here in verse 18, Methuselah, which is close to Methuselah, who we find later on. So there's that other parallel. Lamech is also repeated because Lamech, I think, was Noah's dad, if I'm not mistaken. And so you find a lot of these names repeated. So it's interesting that it's like these two mirror families, two images, where they have sometimes the same name, but it's like they have different they have different journeys where one decides to follow God and the other one doesn't. And so here's the thing I think we need to try to remember is that, you know, in your case, you don't have to try to make up for your parents' failures. Okay? Because the idea is that the children aren't judged for the sins of the parents. There's another part of that where it says the Bible doesn't hold the children accountable for the sins of the parents. However, as we said, there's something to be said about the legacy that we leave our kids and our families based on the way that we live. You know, I was just talking to, I've spoken so much recently to some friends of mine about the impact that I'm learning now as a dad, recognizing there's some things that I face where I'm dealing with things that I didn't face until I was a kid, like baggage and stuff like that. Because in some ways we all grow up in certain contexts where we're given a set of cards, but those set of cards don't define you. But what we find is that a whole family just no one decided to change that script, where this guy falls, Cain, and by the time a few generations later, he's like, listen, if Cain was avenged 7 times, I'm gonna be avenged 70 times 7 times, 77-fold. So there's that parallel with Jesus was like, if anyone sins against you, you forgive him 70 times 7 times. But you know, like, he's like, forget it. You know, anyone is going to what I was finishing with that, where basically your story doesn't define, your family doesn't define your reality. You can change if you choose to, but no one chose to in Cain's story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So another thing on, can we speculate on what the mark was? I mean, you can speculate, but I wouldn't recommend it because we don't know what it was. If we want to build a theology upon it, that's dangerous territory, because we don't know what it was. And so when we're adding to things, last time we talked about this was in Genesis chapter 3, where Eve added certain things, and we don't want to add certain things to what God says.
I mean, all it says in the Hebrew is that it's a distinguishing mark. That's it. It doesn't lead you to believe anything else apart that it's a distinguishing mark. Yeah.
I know that up there was the mark of the beast, but here's an interesting thing where this mark of the beast, find Revelation, by the way, in case you're tracking with this. The mark of the beast is given not by God. This was God giving a mark, and we don't know where it was. It wasn't on the forehead. It was just a distinguishing mark. And so to kind of play wordplay with this, I would not do that, because you can take anything and run with come to a lot of crazy conclusions. Yeah. So another question here. So what avenging of Cain did he refer to? Yeah. How would God avenge? What kind of avenging is God doing? Where it says God is an avenger. God is an avenger, by the way. People said, "Oh, don't watch the Avengers." God is an avenger. God is the first avenger. And here we can, it's not full speculation, because we do have further on the precedent that Lafitte mentioned about where life for a life, if you will. That was the whole point of God making tunics for Adam and Eve, where you recognize that the life, as says later on in Leviticus 17:11, where the life of the thing is in the blood. And so there was something about the blood sacrifices that was a way of God using this this culturally practiced ritual phenomenon to remind people about the consequences of sin. From our standpoint, obviously, as modern readers, we find this super gross and not necessary, but there was something about that time where God used it to remind people of that. And so when it comes to the avenging, who knows if God would have sent, I don't know, legions, or I don't know, who knows. Then here we are speculating in that sense. But the point is, God would do some sort of avenging. And here's the thing. When we're reading through the stories of the New Testament and Old Testament, and you know this from your experience, you see so much evil happening in the world, and you find out, hey, what's going to happen? Listen, if you look here in verse 10, Genesis 4:10, where God tells Cain, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Okay, so this is one time where God, maybe of metaphorical sense, saying, "Listen, I hear his blood, and it's crying out to me from the ground." In the book of Revelation chapter 5, if I'm not mistaken, we find these saints under the altar saying the same thing, and they're saying, "Until when, God? Until when will you step in?" And so throughout the entire Bible, we have this cry for justice, where God will give justice for people who have been the victims of injustice, just like Abel was in this case. And so how will God deal with it? That's kind of how the Bible tries to play this out. It's trying to say, hey, God is going to work everything, but you need to trust him. And again, the whole point of the entire Bible, the question it's trying to answer is, can you trust God for the big things in life if we can't trust him in the little things like these things? So yeah, that's just some thoughts on that.
All right.
Oh, look at the time.
Yeah.
Any thoughts, closing thoughts, guys?
For me is verse 9, where Abel says, am I my brother's keeper? And basically he's saying to God, I'm not responsible. You are. He's shifting the blame back to God, just like Adam did. And it's interesting that the rest of the Bible answers the question. Yes, we are our brothers and sisters' keepers.
Yeah.
That's my thought.
Well put. I want to say, like, these first opening chapters have just, to me, I see the importance of listening to God's word, because in the end, it's not, God doesn't punish because because you ate of the fruit, or because you because you killed your brother. Yes, we do have consequences for those things, but at the end of the day, it was the disobedience to his word, and that's what makes it so powerful to see how John introduces Jesus into the Bible narrative, how he introduces Jesus into the gospel narrative by saying that he is the Word, and just showing us, like, hey, you said no to God, and you just completely trampled over his word. That was your response from creation. And now let me show you a way back to be able to live in the Word of God through Jesus. And so I think that that's really impactful when you look at these first opening chapters and you compare them to the gospel narrative in the New Testament. You're like, it really just opens up a whole new way of looking at Scripture and life.
That's dope. One of the things. Oh, Luffy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to show, because Marlon hit the home run. What I love of this story is God's grace and protection for an unrepentant murder.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good one, Marlon.
Absolutely good. My thoughts on this is I love kind of what Brian mentioned at the beginning. Like, an unsung hero in this is Eve, where it was Eve's first folly, to kind of start this ball rolling. But here she's the one that has, like, she's grown in this, where God isn't. So she's not doing what her husband did and not take the blame for it. Yeah, she probably had pride, so she called Cain Cain. But then she learns from this, and now she calls, like Brian said, she calls Seth a gift. And she doesn't get upset with God. It doesn't say, she's like, God, why did you allow this thing? Now my Abel killed son. So she shows that she grew and learned from her experience rather than taking any blame. She's like, okay, she grew in her own experience. And so Eve, to me, is like an unsung hero in this, because this is the last time we hear of Eve in the Bible, but we see the growth. So I think we'll see the salvation of Eve in this situation. We see that she's learned and she's growing from her life and growing from her mistakes. Yeah. So beautiful.
Well, great job, guys.
All right. So take it easy, Lafitte. Take it easy. Thanks for joining us. Brian, take it easy. Thanks for joining us. And thank you for joining us again for our episode 3. We hope this has been a really great time. We enjoy being with you guys here every week on Facebook, YouTube, 9 o'clock every night. So please make it the habit. If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube or like our page on Facebook to get our updates of when we'll be airing next. It's always on Wednesdays at 8 o'clock. But if you haven't seen the last episodes, go back and check them out. They're in our Facebook feed and our YouTube feed. That's easier because you can search for The Gospel Story. You will find it. Next week, we're going to be looking at Genesis 4 and Genesis 5. We're going to be looking at how humanity began this descent into chaos that ultimately ended with God saying, okay, we're going to cancel the whole thing and we're going to start again from scratch. That's crazy. How did it get there? Read next week. Till then, we want to wish you the best. God bless you and have a wonderful evening.